Hi guys, and welcome back for the second part of the rebuild for Racing Puma 263. And as you can see, I've got the head off the car now, and I'm just removing all the buckets out the cylinder head, buckets and shims, and I've got a box that's arranged that I've labelled so that everything comes out and goes back in exactly the same order, because you really don't want to mix up the valve shims. And on to removing the valves now. I'm using a valve spring compressor that I got from Machine Mart, just a basic one, but it does the job. So you just have to be really careful as you apply that onto the valve so that you don't snag the bucket area where the buckets go. And there's very little room for error actually, it only just fits in there, and you've got to be careful when the valve spring compressor compresses, when it snaps on, or even worse actually when you snap it back off again, that it doesn't jolt too much and jar the edges of the buckets. Getting to those valves near the inside of the head is a little bit more fiddly. Notice that I'm sort of balancing the head off the edge of the bench a bit there, and just using a couple of heavy pieces of steel there on the back just to weigh the back of the cylinder head back so I don't tip it over on the floor. Here I'm removing the valve stem seals with a good grippy pair of pliers. Again, you've got to reach through the bucket area here to grab onto these, so you just got to be very careful as you wiggle those pliers that you don't again snag that critical area where the buckets fit into. Okay, so on with the next job. Head's nice and clean, it's been nicely skimmed, it's all been decoat. Next job is just to clean the valves up and get those back into the head with some new valve stem oil seals. I've just done a very quick before and after sort of shot here of the valves, just as all the cleaning of them. It's just a bit too lengthy to add into the video. Okay, and onto some valve lapping now. Now notice that I'm doing this by hand and not with a drill attachment or anything like that. If you do it by hand, it's much less problematic. You can feel what you're doing, and also as you grind in the paste you can hear what you're doing as well, so you can hear when it's smoothed out. It's just a lot safer way of doing it. Notice I'm lubricating the valve as well, so that when I spin it round it doesn't scratch in there. The inlet valves are an easier sort of size to get on with, much easier to stick the grinding tool on. The exhaust valves are just a little bit more of an awkward size, a little bit more fiddly as they're a bit smaller. Okay, so that's the inlet valves done. Onto the exhaust valves now. Now you build up a bit of a love-hate relationship with these things, as you'll see with the exhaust valves, because the stick fits really nicely onto the inlet valve there, but trying to find a size that fits nicely onto the exhaust valve is a bit tricky. That one is a bit too big and this one's a bit too small, and they end up coming off and it's a bit of a pain. Notice that as I've lapped each valve into the head, the valve then goes back in the box again in order until it's all done. You have to be very meticulous, very clean and careful that none of the grinding paste, none of that lapping paste stays in the cylinder head. So you have to be very careful how you wipe it out and also how you wash it through. So when you install the valves, you have to make sure that there's no grittiness or any of that paste left in there. On to installing the valve stem oil seals now. So I'm just inserting them roughly in place with a pair of little pliers and my finger, and then I'm going to use the correct insertion tool for just pressing them firmly into place in the exact location. Here I'm just installing the hardened shims that sit underneath the valve springs here. And now I've turned the head back over and I'm going to insert all the valves. No, that's not a shot glass of whiskey. It's actually a little shot glass of oil there that I'm just dipping in, just so that the valve goes nice and smoothly through that valve stem oil seal and doesn't get scratched on the way through. If you were going to attempt this sort of cylinder head job, I thoroughly recommend just watching a few videos on YouTube. There's loads of good videos out there on valve lapping that go into it in a bit more detail than my video here, that show you the ins and outs. But I would recommend definitely doing it by hand. Learn it by hand first. It's a lot safer and you really get a much better feel for what you're doing. With a drill attachment, it really is a bit more risky, and you just haven't got the same sort of feel for it. And in with the valve springs, there we go. And back with the valve spring compressor tool now. Notice I've weighted the back of the cylinder head again, and the fiddly bit of putting these valve collets back in correctly. Okay, so one last little job left to do. I've got to put all my buckets and shims back in. Now you probably noticed when I disassembled it that I've put them all in order in this box, which is a handy thing to do, and I've labelled it all up. But before I do that, I'm just going to turn this over one last time and double check that I'm happy with the face of the cylinder head there, and make sure it's absolutely spot on clean. As soon as I put all the buckets in, I won't be able to turn it back over again without them falling out. So onto that. Now notice when I clean and wipe this, I'm using an old t-shirt, an old cotton t-shirt. Try not to use like a microfiber cloth or blue roll or something like that, because it ends up leaving loads of fibres all over it. Especially blue roll, it just rips to shreds on all the sharp edges. So I prefer to just use like an old t-shirt. Okay, and here I'm putting the buckets and shims back in. Notice I'm giving the shims just a little dip in some oil. Just be very careful how you locate those back in the entry there. Don't try and force them in. They should be a nice neat fit, and when you've got them in, they should spin freely and move freely. If the bucket seems to resist going back in and doesn't really want to locate again, just remove it, check the edges, make sure there's no damage, give it another dip in the oil and have another go. Don't, whatever you do, try and force it in and bang it down, because if there is some damage you'll be really struggling to get it back out again. So it should be a nice easy fit. And back into the garage. Here I've just got a few still shots of what I've done with the block. So I've worked my way around the face of that and just cleaned it up with gasket scraper and with a Stanley blade, just in very small sections. Just clean off the old gasket, the remnants of the old gasket, clean it up so it's absolutely spotless, and also work around the pistons a little bit with the gasket scraper too, just to clean those back. And the new head gasket going on here. One last little clean of the cylinder head before it goes back on. Here I'm just unpacking the L-ring head bolt pack, and I'm just going to slightly lubricate the bottom of the threads and also the top of the head of the bolt, so that they torque up nice and freely. Here I'm using a little pick tool just to lower the washers carefully into place. You can't really do it with your fingers because you can't get your fingers in there. Now I think I should clarify here, I'm not using the impact gun to torque the head down. I'm just putting the screw down so it just hits the washer. You'll find here that if you do buy the L-ring gasket and bolts kit, you do actually get the tightening sequence printed on a sheet, with the gasket. But basically the settings are 15 Newton meters, 30 Newton meters, and then plus 90 degrees on every bolt in the correct order. Unfortunately my camera ran out of battery as I was actually halfway through this and I didn't realise, so a vital chunk was missing. I thought it would be a good time now to put some spark plugs into the head, just in case any bolts drop as I'm installing the cams. I didn't really want it falling through those holes. Okay, so on to fitting the cams back on the head now. Now if you're watching this video and you're going to have a go at this for the first time, be very careful how you reinstall the VCT cam. It's a bit more fiddly to get back on, and you have to really locate it well and make sure you tap it down to get it down in the right place. And then I tend to use a socket and just tighten them all bit by bit. You can see the cam caps, and you can get an idea for the clearance of the cam caps, and just make sure they all go down bit by bit, nice and evenly. So make sure they're all down by hand before you put a wrench on it to do the final torque settings. Notice also that I clean the bolts quite well, and I'm just applying a bit of lock thread back onto the screw threads. There you can see me just adjusting making sure the VCT solenoid is in the correct place, and then I'm just going around all the cam cap bolts by hand, making sure they're all right. You really don't want to get this wrong, because it's you can snap the cam quite easily on the VCT cam. It's not so much of an issue on the exhaust one, it's quite easy to fit back. On with installing the cam seals here. Got to be very careful that these locate into the grooves on the cylinder head very precisely. Make sure they're pushed right back, otherwise you'll be doing the whole lot again. There's a two-stage tightening sequence for the cam caps, 8 Newton meters and then 17 Newton meters to finish them off. Cam pulley's going back on now, but notice that I leave the bolts finger loose, so they're not torqued up yet. Okay, so I've just turned the engine around so you can see me just tweaking the cams around a little bit so that I can install the cam lobe positioning bar. And notice here I'm lubricating the bar a bit so as not to damage the cylinder head. On to building up the rest of the timing now, so just cleaning up the guard. Going to put that on with some new screws, and then one of the bottom pulleys that the belt goes on. Just putting the cam belt tensioner on here. I think I use some lock thread on these bolts. You don't really have to, it's not written to do so, but I don't think it can harm. And I'm going to wrap the belt round there. Nothing's torqued up yet, of course. The settings for the timing belt tensioner were 35 Newton meters on the bigger bolt and 20 Newton meters on the little adjustment bolt. I should probably just clarify that the bolt that I talked up there was the larger one, the 35 Newton meters. The smaller one hasn't been done yet. Okay, so I've just installed the guard there, and I'm on to installing the bottom pulley. Now I just cleaned the face of this and just run some wet and dry on the front face of that where the bolt sits against it, just so it's nice and clean, because it is only the pressure of that flange on the bolt that holds the whole lot together. So you really don't want it to be oily or messy. Okay, on with installing that bottom pulley now. I think I'm also turning the crank round a little bit, inserting the top dead center pin so that the crank now sits against that pin. Okay, and on to torquing up this bottom pulley. So there's a 3-stage sort of setting on this, 25 Newton meters and then 40 Newton meters, and then crank it round plus another 90 degrees. Critical part of the servicing here, so I'm going to withdraw the pin from the tensioner and you'll see the belt get tensioned in between the two cam pulleys. And here we go, there it goes. So if you've got the cams locked up and pre-torqued, you know, if they're both torqued up and they're locked up at the back of the cams, then of course you're not going to be able to re-tension that critical area between the two pulleys. So it's absolutely imperative that those bolts for the cam pulleys are just finger loose at that stage. Once the tension has been applied to the belt, you can then leave the pin halfway in and adjust the small adjustment screw, the 20 Newton meters on the tensioner, just to set the position of the back plate there, so that there is a bit of kickback space for the tensioner. Then on to torquing up the cam pulleys. So I've done 60 Newton meters on the exhaust cam pulley, and now I'm just going to do the 105 Newton meters to the inlet pulley, which is not so easy, I can tell you. Also, while I was torquing up those pulleys, I still had the cam locking bar in place at the back of the cams. Now if you were doing this with the engine in the car, there is no way you would risk that, because you risk snapping the end of the cam off, because it's just too awkward. But with the engine out of the car, you can resist the movement of the cam by hand. So that's the timing side of things pretty much done, apart from the bottom pulley stretch bolt hasn't been turned around the plus 90 degrees yet. So I don't really want to turn that the full 90 degrees just against the top dead center pin, because I don't want to snap that pin. And I can't really lock the flywheel because I haven't got the flywheel attached. So you've got the choice of either carrying on and just make sure you don't move the engine round and wait till you get the engine on the floor to put the flywheel on and then lock the flywheel. Or you could, I suppose, take the engine off the stand, put the flywheel on, turn the 90 degrees, and then put the engine back on the stand if you wanted to turn it round and just check that the locking bar still went in the correct place in the cams. Personally, because I've done this that many times, I know the settings are right, so I tend to just leave that 90 degrees till a bit later in the service, till I've finished the engine, and then I'll put the engine on the floor and then finish it off then. Okay, so upside down the engine goes, and I'm going to reinstall the oil baffle plate, the oil feed pipe, and the upper sump section, which has been pre-painted. Always a good idea to use a good quality sealant for these sump sections. You really don't want to be doing it again, so I use a Worth sealant here. Always nice to use new bolts here. The old ones always look such a mess and plastered in 15-year-old sealant. I noticed I've attached a scabby old lower tray here to the bottom of the engine because I've got a nice painted one for this engine. I don't want to scratch it all when I put the engine back on the floor. So the nicely painted one will be fitted a bit later when the engine's back in the car. Well, as you can see, I'm having a bit of fun with this snapped bolt that holds the aircon pump on, and I've just heated it up and I thought there's no way I'm going to get this out, but I've managed to just get it moving a little bit, which I'm really pleased about. So here goes, let's see if we can get this damn thing out. Hey! Look at that little bugger, eh? Ah! Wow. Smoked the paint a bit, but at least we've got it out. Just putting the thermostat housing back on now. I tend to do a little wipe of sealant just inside that location where the thermostat goes, because the thermostat tends to be smaller than the actual location, so I tend to just sort of stick it in there. And also there's a new seal built onto the thermostat, and also use a new seal for the other part of the housing, which is available to buy from Ford. Seem to be constantly hitting new problems on this car. I couldn't get the sensor back in, it just wouldn't go into the housing at all, so I had to smash the housing out from the inside out and clean all that out before I could get that, before I have any chance of getting the sensor back in there. Okay, so I'm just going to clean off the top of the cylinder head one last time just before I install back the top cam cover. I tend to stick the gasket into the top cam cover just with a small wipe of sealant all the way around the groove, so that when I put the top cover back on it doesn't flop around all over the place. But I don't stick the gasket down to the top of the head, because then if you want to remove it you've got a right faff. Here I'm also just going to replace a seal that's in the top cover where the cam sensor goes. I don't think anyone ever changes these, but they do go quite sort of hard and brittle over time, they tend to leak a bit, so it's worthwhile changing. Inlet going back on now. And I noticed just before I sort of put this back on, I've put the oil separation valve onto the breather pipe before I put it back on. And it's just a bit easier to insert back that way. Fiddly bolts to get back in a fiddly place. Remember, I used that extra long ring spanner to get them off, and you have to use that to get them back on again, especially the one that's in the lower middle bolt. You have to just turn that a few millimeters at a time. It's a bit of a pain, really. cam cover going back on now. Always a nice feeling when you get to this bit. Feels like you're actually just about there, although with this car I was probably only halfway there. But there we go. Here I'm just installing a new auxiliary drive pulley, and then I'm just going to run a tap into those bolt areas where the aircon pump bolts into, just so that we don't get any problems with snapping the bolts again. Okay, so this is the little sucker that I had all that issue with before, with the Allen key head on it. So I brought a new tool and we'll see if it does the job. I think it will do on the way back in. It's just getting it out that's always the issue. Yep, I think that's definitely the tool for the job. So just to clarify what that was there, it was an Allen key with a 3/8 socket drive and a ball end on the front of it, just to give you an extra few degrees of manoeuvrability. Now I'm just finishing the bits and bobs off underneath that inlet, so there's some wiring loom to get in the right place, and the starter motor, and a couple of mounting brackets for the inlet as well, which don't really do a whole lot, but they're there anyway. Here I'm just cutting down a little bit off a serrated flange head screw, just to use for the dip tube, so they get a nice grip on there. The bolt that's on there originally is a very short one, so I'm just using a slightly longer one. So here I'm just going to change out the inlet temperature sensor and then move on to the coolant housing on the side of the engine where the coil pack sits. And then back round to the thermostat housing again. I just want to get these hoses back on there and clipped in place before I put the engine back in, because it really is a right faff to get into that area when the engine's back in, so it's much easier now. Okay, so I'm kind of done with this one now. I've just got to take it off the stand, turn that round to the full 90 degrees, put the power steering pump bracket back on, a few brackets around the back, and Bob's your uncle. Did I mention earlier in the video about this? So the bolt that goes through that bush is completely and utterly seized in there. Of course I tried to turn it and snap, which has created a right load of faff, so I've had to remove the whole subframe off the car. I did mount the subframe in my drill press to try and drill that bolt out, but it was, as I tried to extract the bolt, it just snapped off the whole captive nut, so I had to have a new nut welded on there to fix the subframe. So I thought I may as well change these anti-roll bar bushers while I'm at it. It's a nice easy job, just 2 minutes to fit new ones on there. So subframe back on the car, and then I can stick the engine back in. On with the next little job. I noticed when this car came in, it had a very stiff sort of gear stick. I did wonder if there's a problem in the box or the linkage or something like that. So anyway, I took the gear linkage off, and now normally these go very loose and saggy and they just go bleh. But this one is so seized up, I'm surprised by the feel of that we actually managed to change gear at all. It's so seized up. I suspect what's happened there is they've greased it trying to get it going, or trying to lubricate it, and all the grease has just congealed and got dirty, and it's actually just seized the whole thing up. So we're going to fit a nice new one, which has got a good new pivot joint, so it pivots that way and that way, with a nice sort of stiff feel to it, but it does actually pivot. So we're going to put that on the car next. Okay, and then there was the gear linkage, the dreaded gear linkage. Well, normally these are quite easy to service, and there's only 2 bolts holding that whole sort of mechanism there, but in this case it was completely seized up and I just couldn't get it apart. I wasted about 2 hours on it, and I was not happy at all. Well, I've been prattling about with this thing for over an hour now. I'm tearing my hair out with the damn thing. The screw that holds that all together is totally fused up in there. There's nothing left of the bolt, and I'm basically just cut down the flange head of the bolt now to see if I can turn that. It's turned into a bit of a nightmare. To say the least. I've wasted so much time on this, it's just ridiculous. think basically the bush that's underneath there, the threaded part, is just spinning round now in the plastic because it's just knackered. So I don't think we're going to get this out. It's just wasted ages on it now. Very pissed off. Very pissed off. Well, as you can see, I was pretty happy about that one. Moving on, so I've got the engine on the floor now, so I'm going to put the flywheel back on, put a new clutch on there, and then of course finish off that 45 degrees, sorry, the 90 degrees on the bottom pulley bolt. And of course, before I put that gearbox back in, I'm just going to remove this concentric bearing here and just put a new one on there. Alright folks, so hopefully this is the last day on this project today. I'm going to try and get everything done and turn the key at last. Now yesterday I had an absolute la-la in the garage with this stupid thing, this gear linkage. It's all seized up. In fact, I've never seen one like it. Normally they go very floppy and dangle all over the place and you get a very loose gear stick. This one's completely seized up. I tried for a couple of hours to dismantle it, get these bolts out. I must have done 10 or 20 of these in the past. I've never had one that I've not been able to get apart, but in true FRP fashion, I got one that I just could not get apart. I managed to get one of the bolts out, but the other one was so seized in there, it just broke the threaded inserts inside and ended up chewing there's only a small head on there to get to, ended up chewing it to bits. And in the end I had an absolute Benny and threw it out the garage and threw my toys out the pram and called it a day because I got so cheesed off with it. So luckily came to the rescue. Puma Bits have sent me this one, which is very handy. So this is a typical one that's been on the car for, I don't know, 15-20 years. So the linkage is all pretty floppy, well worn, but the bolts don't look too bad on this one. Now this looks pretty much how they all look, so I'm not expecting any problems getting those out. One is a bit more rusty than the other, but hopefully this is just like all the others I've done and doesn't present a problem. So I'm going to change this pole for a new one so that we can restore the gear linkage feel back to brand new again.
On the other one, the bolts were so rotten, there was nothing left of the head to actually get to, so it was a bit of a non-starter from the beginning. Piece of cake! Nice spanking new one. Get a good feel for that. So it's not floppy like that one. Job's a good one. On with the next little job. Next little job is to replace this intermediate bearing on the drive shaft. It's absolutely knackered. It should have a really sort of, it should have a very tight feel to it, like that. And this one is as rough as anything, and it's just, you know, it's had its day and it's knackered. So we're going to replace it. I did have some music on this section, but I've had to re-go over the video and delete it just because of copyright issues, and it somehow gets very easily spotted and flagged. So yeah, you can see what's going on here. So basically I used an air cut-off tool just to sort of make an incision into the outside sort of casing of that bearing, and then I've just sort of prized it apart a little bit with a screwdriver and then whacked it with a hammer just to knock off that outside part of the casing. And then what happens is all the ball bearings fall on the floor. And then you're left with the inside sort of shell of the bearing, and then you just have to grind that off again with the air tool. Just get rid of that in a couple of places, and then you're left with the area that the bearing sits on the shaft, and then you're basically free then to just press the new bearing on.
Okay, so nice and easy to see what's going on here. So I've cut the bearing off the shaft, dismantled it in pieces, and then I've mounted the bearing on a plate in the press, and then just simply going to push the shaft down onto the bearing.
It's a bit more like it.
So here I'm just going to put the shaft back together now, put some new grease in there, and of course use the proper Ford boot straps, not the crappy motor factor ones that are extremely flimsy.
Well, it's been a hell of a day. It's 5 to 5, but the moment of truth has finally arrived. So I'm going to turn the key and see what happens. And hopefully all is good and healthy with this car. Sounds pretty healthy to me.
So notice there, of course, the engine does take a little while to settle down, as it's had the head off and it's very clean inside there. It does spin quite fast when you first turn the key, and of course will take a few minutes to settle down before it goes into closed loop mode. So I think that's a wrap on this video. Thank you for persevering and watching it. I promise the next one won't be anywhere near as long. It's taken me hours to try and condense down all the hours of footage. So I certainly don't plan to make any videos that are longer than that. So I'll try and keep them a bit shorter in future. Many thanks. Bye.